this time we're in for a serious treat. This is serious food for everybody. We're going to have our esteemed Professor Manu Ampim come and bring us a presentation. I won't be long-winded speaking about Professor Manu. He is a primary researcher, though, specializing in African history and culture. He's a primary researcher. I mean, he does the research himself. He travels widely in the continent, done so much pioneering research on ancient Kush. He's a published author. I don't know how many books, but many. 3. 4? He said 3. Okay. That's from his mouth to my ears. He's still doing tours of the continent. And if you get the chance to go do a tour with Professor Manu, you should go, because he is so full of knowledge. He's a library. He's a walking library. So at this time, he's going to bring us a superb message full of take something out to write with, because he's going to drop some knowledge on you. Ashe? And he's ours. He's ours. Don't forget, he's ours. Let's bring him to the front. Clap for him. Come on.
Good morning, good afternoon. We'll say where we may be. I'm glad to join you. I hope you can hear me online. So I think my should work. Well, obviously this is February, so I don't have much choice other than to talk about the man who's the reason for the season. And that is Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So I want to give you the general overview of Woodson, of what most of you probably know, but I want to go deeper and share with you hopefully some aha moments. Because the further we get away from the passing of Woodson, who passed in 1950, the further we get away from his vision and his work. So even in his day, Dr. Carter G. Woodson said that some of the celebrations in the 1930s were a disgrace that had little to nothing to do with his vision. So in the few minutes that I have, I want to share this with you, and then I have a questionnaire, a group questionnaire at the end. So let's see if we can make this happen. So I want to show you some of the slides and go from there regarding Woodson, who's the man, who's the reason for the season. And there's many celebrations and events that never even mention Woodson. He's not even an afterthought. He's not even included in any kind of way. And actually, last weekend I was in Newark, California, and I was pleased that there was an event that actually, when you walked in, it was honoring Woodson. When I thought about it, which is very rare, but one of the ladies that put it together, Amy Holloway, she's a librarian. I said, well, it figures. Amy, in fact, Amy used to be the librarian for the African American Historical and Cultural Society in San Francisco. That's when I met her in the 90s when I moved back here to the Bay. So I was glad to see that. So I want to discuss really briefly African Heritage Month and the vision of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. It's pretty popular to call it Black History Month, but I want to challenge that idea for the reason of trying to make sure that we can free up his legacy. And it's the reason why Woodson focused on Africa. It's the reason why for the last 12 years, it was very important to me to lift up his voice and paint a different view of what we should be doing in February. It doesn't make any difference if it's 28 days, 29 days, doesn't matter. It can be 31 days. The real culture warrior is promoting and perpetuating African culture and Black culture 366. My math is not off, 366 days a year. So let's be clear about that part. So let me share with you what Woodson was really about. And here I just wanted to include this, the different facets of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, because he went to Morgan State University, my alma mater there in the bottom left. And one of the things about Woodson, because of his talent as a historian and a scholar and an educator, he had many opportunities, but he stayed close to the Black community. He stayed close to the historically black colleges and universities as well. But I want to share with you really something more comprehensive. And if this will work. Okay, all right, so Woodson, these are the years in which he lived, but he made so many contributions. So I'm just listing some of them. He wrote more than a dozen books. Typically, people might know one or maybe two, but he wrote more than a dozen books as a scholar. But it's important to know that too often we, and I want to emphasize we, focus on individuals and not the group. There's no such thing as an individual outside of a group.
Say that.
So there's no Woodson without his organization, by the way.
Yes.
So he formed with others, he didn't do it alone, the Association for the Study, now it's called African American Life and History, ASLA. At the time, they called it Negro, but it doesn't matter. But that was in 1915. And as a scholar, he did what all scholars do. They create journals. As a matter of fact, you all remember that when Dr. Ampim was here in the Bay Area, he was at San Francisco State. He came in 1999. What was the first thing he did? He established the Imhotep Journal. Is it operating now? No, but it was operating then under the great leadership of the scholar Obinga. So you got students involved, and so you always have to have an outlet or an opportunity to promote. So I want to share something with you about the journal that may be new. But he also formed and founded the Associated Publishers. That's just as important as founding the journal. Because for Woodson, it had to be independent thinking, independent writing, and independent scholarship. So this is why Associated Publishers was central to his message and his work. Where's Associated Publishers now? Gone. Those in his organization are not continuing the work of Woodson as an independent publishing house. Nope, they gave the rights away to the University of Chicago Press. So they're in control now, distributing black knowledge. And there was an internal debate, and guess who lost? Those who were the Woodsonians, they lost. So I'm building up to argue an African Heritage Month focus based on what Woodson did. He also recognized, not just him, but it was sisters who were teaching in the schools who said to Woodson that there needed to be a bulletin for teachers and to get the students involved. So the Negro History Bulletin was also published every month, and it was mainly the teachers and students who were publishing in that bulletin. And Woodson listened and pretty much gave the bulletin to the teachers. So this is the 99th annual celebration of what I call African Heritage Month. So that's just kind of a background. So, and of course, he had a stamp in his honor back in 1984 because of his tremendous influence through his organization. But these are some of the arguments of Woodson. And it's interesting how he embraced Africa from the very beginning. And those books and those articles and those book reviews that he did, I've not seen scholars address that at all. It's almost as if the evidence doesn't exist when it's staring at us and it's in plain sight. Now, Woodson wasn't always consistent in how he saw Africa. This is the early 20th century, so he didn't have a full knowledge. He didn't go to the field, but he did have some clarity in certain moments, like when he argued that both Ethiopia, well, that's the Greek name for Kush, and Nubia were the forerunners of Kemet. He said that. He was clear when he made that particular statement. He didn't stop there. Woodson also said that they were also in Kush and Nubia, they taught Kemet. And then from there, Kemet influenced the rest of the Mediterranean world. We've heard that, we've seen that, others have written about that, but not before Woodson. Woodson wrote about that first. Woodson promoted that first. There were no other scholars promoting that on that level other than William Leo Hansberry. Also, guess what? The influence of the Nile Valley civilizations and Black people in particular were at the forefront of human enlightenment, according to none other than Woodson. And this goes missing. It's amazing how you can have some of the most accomplished African-American scholars, and this goes missing in their review of Woodson. So we have to save Woodson's legacy and help amplify his voice. So what were some of his contributions? He put Black people in the center of our own experience. That's very important, to center Black people. Also, he made sure that we were the subject. and not the object of somebody else's contempt. This was a concern of Woodson, that whenever we were discussed, it was an afterthought. Whenever we were discussed, it was something negative. So for Woodson, it was to place the person of African descent in the center of his and her experience and make them the subject. And so he was the forerunner of the African-centered movement, as many of us in Wolsey are well aware of. So when the movement burst on the scene in 1984, with the scholars from LA, some of you went to the ASCAC conference, and scholars from Atlanta and Chicago and New York, guess what? They were building on the tradition and legacy of Woodson. But Woodson was completely left out of the discussion and the history and narrative of those that had been forerunners. People mention Martin Delaney, they mention others, they mention Hansberry, but it's amazing that there's no discussion of Woodson whatsoever when his scholarship and his writing was well known in the 1920s, 1930s, but yet his prominent place went missing. So let me ask you all a question. What can we say, what publication can we say is the most prominent publication in the second half of the 20th century? Or to be more specific, the last quarter of the 20th century that dealt with African civilization? I mean, what journal? Sorry, what journal? What publication? So what journal? Online also, you can put it in. So the question is, what publication? I mean, a journal, newsletter, magazine. What publication in the last quarter of the 20th century had the greatest impact on elevating and promoting African civilizations? Van Sertima was Journal of African Civilizations. You all know the Journal of Black Women in Antiquity, for example. Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern, the African Presence in Early America, African Presence in Early Europe, African Presence in Early Asia, great African thinkers, Sheikh Anta Diop. So Van Sertima made a tremendous impact from 1979 to 94 with the Journal of African Civilizations. And the last issue in the journal is Egypt, Child of Africa. That was published in 1994. I have 2 essays in there. One of the great surprises in my academic career to receive a phone call from none other than Ivan Van Sertima. I was going to a meeting on a Saturday, the phone rang, so I kind of hesitated at the door. I didn't know it was from me or somebody else, and the sister said it was Van Sertima. I said, who? So I kind of creeped to the phone and I said, hello? So this is Ivan Van Sertima. So I speak to Manu Ampim. I said, this is he, sir. So he went on to tell me that he was aware of my work and wanted me to publish in the journal. And the humble, great scholar Ivan Van Sertima said very kind of shyly that, and almost apologetically, that he can only offer me $300 to have my work published in the journal. Offer me $300. I would have borrowed and begged for $300 to get my work in the Journal of African Civilizations. But Van Sertima's work has had an indelible imprint as he published this journal. It woke up Africans around the world in various regions. But guess what? It wasn't entirely original. It was great scholarship, but I mean, there's a forerunner, and the forerunner was, guess who? Carter G. Woodson. I'll share that with you. So for Woodson, this is all of the things he did to spread the knowledge. I've shared this with you before, but public lectures were just part of it. Teacher lesson plans, that was big for Woodson. Posters, images, images are impactful. I don't know who counted, but somebody said an image is worth, what they say? I don't know if it's worth 999 words, 1,002. All I know is images are impactful. Black History Clubs, where people get together and read. Black History Kits was teachers, and for schools, speeches, plays, you name it. But guess what? He took it further. He's not only teaching people as scholars and impacting teachers, impacting college students, high school students, but guess what? But also in the community. He had a correspondence course, guess what? With rigorous standards for the average person at home to learn about his and her history and make it real and relevant. Can you imagine a home study course in the 1920s? Who does that? Woodson does that and did that. Not discussed. His book, some of you may be aware, but if not, we need to know that the Negro in our history in 1922, this was the standard text to learn about Black people in the U.S. for decades. until Franklin wrote his book, what was Frank, from Slavery to Freedom. That replaced Woodson's book as the premier book dealing with the Black experience in the U.S. So it's a fundamental textbook. Obviously, we know about the miseducation. We quote this a lot, but Woodson's influence is much larger. Now, if I was going to give you a quote from this book, if I was going to give you a quote, I'm sure some of you can probably predict what it would be, right? You can probably predict what it is, so I'll give it to you. I got about 20 that I can use, but the one that I'm sure you're familiar with. Then after this, I want to go beyond. You've seen this, you've read it, you know about it. If you control a man and woman's thinking, you not have to worry about his or her action. When you determine a man, what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do.
Right.
So you make a man feel inferior, so that you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek one himself.
Right.
Come on now.
He will find the back door.
Yeah.
One of the great, and nobody can just come up with some quote like this. This is someone who knows from the inside. Yes, this is inside knowledge. However, we know about that. But what I want to share with you for the balance of what I have to say is the other Woodson that doesn't get discussed, that's not followed. So in my book, you may have the first edition, but in the second edition of my book, I think that's probably why the count was off. I said 3, someone said 4, but this is the second edition, so I was just counting this as 1.
Okay.
But I want to point out that I added a section on Woodson. I had no choice but to add the section on Woodson. So here's where I want to veer off from what we generally know to something that is more or less not too well known. One of the things that motivated the great Woodson is the fact that you had the most prominent scholars like George Hegel. If anybody gets a degree in philosophy, they have to study Hegel. And Hegel was apologetic to even have to mention Africa. He said Africa had no historical part of the world, that there's no development in Africa, and any development in the north, meaning in the Kemet areas, because there was the Europeans and the so-called Asiatics. And then he apologized to his audience that I had to even mention this. So Hegel talking craziness. I went to Morgan State University. Guess who introduced me to Arnold Toynbee, one of the Black professors? Never told us about the Toynbee that I learned about. Toynbee, one of the great British historians, he also said that out of the 26 civilizations since the beginning of humanity, the only primary race that has not contributed to any of them is the Black race. Are you kidding me? No, he wasn't kidding. So you can't get a degree in history without asking the question, what does Toynbee say? So this is what Woodson was responding to. So for Woodson, publishing the truth with self-defense. Yes, it's battle, it's a warfare. It's publishing the truth with self-defense. That's why he pressed upon his colleagues that they had to organize Associated Publishers. Very important. It's about self-defense. Now, here's some things that we really need to make sure that we are leaders. And we'll say, what was the focus of Woodson? I'm glad you asked. Let me point out and confirm what the focus is of Woodson. It was achievements, accomplishments, and contributions. You know why? Because Woodson, like Marcus Garvey, was concerned about whether or not we can physically survive in the 20th century. He was concerned by that. You read Woodson, he's talking about and using the word extermination. He's concerned about the vicious white supremacists. Remember, this is the age of lynching Black folks as a public spectacle, a public sport. So this is the concern of him, but it's achievements, accomplishments, and contributions in the world and not what some people think. So here's what the focus in February was not about. This is very important because most of the events that happen every year, like Woodson said, he called them a disgrace. I say that 90+% have little to nothing to do with Woodson. Doesn't make any difference who's used to it. It's not accurate if we read what his concerns were. And you talk about somebody who criticized folks around him and fell out with people. Yeah, he fell out because Woodson was a man of integrity. He didn't have to be right on 110% of everything, but he was a man of integrity. You didn't like it, so what? It didn't really matter. Woodson criticized those folks who focused in February on Black problems. Always a problem. He said Black people cannot always be associated with a problem. Who got beat down by the police? Who got slapped around? Who do we need to get out of jail or help rally behind? He said, no, we have to make sure we assert our humanity, the achievements, the accomplishments and contributions in the world. So this is why Woodson criticized people in his day who will always focus on problems. He said, no, we can't do that. We don't always represent a problem. So the time should be what? Celebrations, accomplishment, contributions that have nothing to do with, we can pick the problems up in March 1st. And go back around to January 31st. But the issue is that there has to be a focus on positivity. You have no idea how brutal Woodson was when he criticized the continual focus on individuals. He said the celebrations focused on Abraham Lincoln and Douglas. He said it was a disgrace. He also criticized people running around lecturing. He said that these were people that have good bellows, they have good lungs, but they don't know very much. He criticized the events. He said people would eat and drink, and by the time they eat and drink, the speaker and the audience can't remember what was even said. Yes, he's criticizing because he's the leader with the vision. And he didn't just conceive of a week. And so we know, many of us, that Woodson chose the second week in February because it was the birthday of what? Lincoln. How could it be the birthday of Douglas when Douglas himself had no idea when he was born? He don't even know the year, 1817, 1818. It's just a guess that Frederick Douglass was born February 14th. We don't know. No one knew that, but people just assumed. So Woodson said, well, why don't we choose the second week since the community was geared up towards having events anyway? And let's just kind of go with the flow. That's why the second week in February was chosen, but he was a harsh critic of focusing on individuals as opposed to group accomplishments. That's more important, the group accomplishments. So a lot of times we teach children, we teach the community to focus on individuals. Rosa Parks, she was the legal secretary of the NAACP and an organizer, not just an individual. Right. But that's how it's presented. She was tired, it was not only that, it was Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council. They had already organized. They already had signs. Another Negro woman arrested before the arrest. They already had phone trees set up. They already had the carpool set up.
Right.
They were looking for what they call the right test case. Let's get it straight. It's not just some little old lady who's 42. It's more than that. It's organization. Now, Brother Ty was talking about a boycott. We know that that's difficult for people to give up things. But what did they do in Montgomery? 381 days. You can't get everybody, but they had 99% compliance.
Right.
99%. You always gonna have one or two or three, but 99% of the people didn't ride the bus.
Right.
Yeah, they didn't ride the bus because they were standing up for dignity and respect. And as Dr. King said, nobody can ride your back unless it's bent. Nevertheless, it's organizations, not individuals. That's what's the point and made by Woodson. And guess what? He didn't just focus on the experience here in the U.S. Never did. From the beginning of his work to the end, Woodson dealt with the African world in general, including those of us in the U.S. But you look at how he's presented by Osceola's organization and most of the folks who organize events. It's not consistent with the grand vision of Woodson. By the way, Woodson talked about a Black History year. He just started with a week. He didn't just conceive of a month, but an entire year. Yes, he did. He spoke about it, but you got to bring people along. So yes, he saw the need to know about people who made a contribution. This is why he wrote the Negro Makers of History in 1928, but he went beyond that. This is what is left out. Woodson and African history and contributions. So you let me know towards the end if I make the case about African Heritage Month and Carter G. Woodson. It's just not me coming up with something, but I'm led there by none other than Woodson himself. You look at all of the biographies, you have well-trained scholars that are writing about the Black history movement in the early 20th century, nothing about Africa. A passing line about Africa, then they move on. Yeah, or nothing at all, which is shameful. So look, Woodson wrote 3 books on Africa. He wrote over a dozen. So the last two that Woodson wrote, by the way, out of the books, the African Background Outline in 1936, and then the last book itself was African Heroes and Heroines. So the last two books he wrote were on Africa. Yes, this is very important. So this is his growing interest. This is what was drawing him more and more to learn more and more about Africa. This is why he began to focus on that even more in his with his books. But that's not the first time. So let me show you the whole pattern. Here's a tremendous article he wrote, by the way, and the Negro in art from where? From Africa to America. He's not just dealing with slavery like Franklin and others. They were looking at West Africa just on the brink before slavery, so we could then have an idea of why West Africa and West Africans were so vulnerable to slavery. No. Woodson went beyond that. When Africa was at the apex of human achievement, that's Woodson's focus. But we're at the apex of the world with achievements, accomplishments, and contributions long before slavery. This is the Negro History Bulletin. I don't know if you can see the date, anybody. Can you see it online or in person? What does it say? Top right, can't see it?
39.
1939.
Okay, exactly, March 1939. Remember, he passed in 1950. So in this article, among many, this is part of what Woodson says in the article. So he writes this: sculpture reached its first high level in ancient times under the Egyptians. The Sphinx near the pyramids of Giza, the temple of Luxor, the rock temple of Abu Simbel, and the obelisk show the greatness of Egyptian architecture and sculpture. So he's not confused whatsoever. We know by the title, he sees these people as what? As Africans. Not as modern day Arabs, but as Africans. How does this get missed when he's writing about this on a regular basis? Not so. The last two books he wrote, The African Background and African Heroes and Heroines. What else? What about the articles that Woodson wrote? You know what? Another good question you just asked. Let me answer it for you. The last articles he wrote, check it out. He's focusing on Africa. The Negro History Bulletin, what's the title there? Just simply Egypt. Okay, we call it Kemet now, but you know the place. So that's one article, but guess what? He doesn't stop there. Second one, on what? On Egypt. He doesn't stop there. And look, there's a third one on Egypt. A 3-part series in 1949 and 50. The last article series written by the great scholar was on what? On Africa. Last 2 books and the last 3 articles focused on Africa. Not only that, but guess what? That's the end, but what about the beginning? So take a look at this. The Journal of Negro History, this is the very first edition. First volume, January 1960. You see volume 1, number 1. So volume means a year and 1 means the number within that year. And you probably can't see this that well, but there are several articles on Africa, the Passage Tradition and the African Civilizations. You know, so you got 3 of these. The mind of the African Negro as reflected in his proverbs. Here's another one. This is the very first issue. Why is this missing from scholarship? His very first issue. Not only that, look at the bulletin. Very first issue of the bulletin in October 1937. You may not can see that this says Africa, a whole column on Africa in dead center on page 6. They cannot be missed. It cannot be dismissed. You got an image of Africa. How can someone be writing a biography of Woodson and leave this out? Is that credible? Absolutely not.
Right.
Yeah, so what I'm doing is, I don't know anybody else who's elevating Woodson in his own words, in his own work. We don't have to make up anything. Okay. So, and guess what? Woodson had a couple unpublished works. One is the, he called it The Case of the Negro in 1921. You know why he didn't publish it? It was the most stunning indictment of white America. He didn't publish it because he figured that whatever little money they were getting, it would totally dry up. So he didn't publish it. That was 12 years before the miseducation. You think the miseducation was stunning? The case for the Negro, it's a whole nother level of condemnation on the outside. So that's one book, but take a look at this. I just have a couple more to show you, and that's encyclopedias. There was an encyclopedia battle between Woodson and none other than W.B. Du Bois. And neither one of them actually published their encyclopedias, but Du Bois was a part of the Phelps Stokes Fund. And this fund, they had a model that was pretty much focused on the Encyclopedia of the Negroes. So Caroline Phelps Stokes had a lot of money that she was giving away that she inherited from her father. So they put together, this is a white woman, they put together a framework for the encyclopedia. So Du Bois was a part of this, and this was going to be a 4-volume work on the Encyclopedia of the Negro. And he was battling with none other than guess who? Carter G. Woodson. So Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, they had conceived of a 10-volume encyclopedia, and then they scaled it down to 6 volumes. And he said it would be 900 to 1,000 words per volume. Now, given what I've shared with you the last 10, 15 minutes, take a look at the title that Du Bois's encyclopedia would have been. You say? Pages. Yeah, so 900 to 1,000 pages per volume. Du Bois said for his, he did use words. He said 500,000 words or something like that. So guess what? You can see the difference. Now, you know Du Bois was positive. Du Bois wrote The World in Africa. He was part of the Pan-African Congresses. But look at the difference between W.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson. Guess what Woodson called his encyclopedia, although they never actually published? Encyclopedia Africana. Yes. You see it, Encyclopedia Africana. Today, we say Africana studies. You know why we say Africana studies? Because it's to focus on Africa and the rest of the world. If you say African American studies, it means Black folks only in the U.S. If you say African studies, it means Africans where? Only in Africa. So Africana is the same as people would say in the 60s and 70s of Pan-African studies. Pan means all. Or Black studies, you know, it was a global view. But African American has value, it's important, but guess what? It's also limited. And you know, talking about the so-called Negro is also limited. I'm not disparaging them, I'm just saying that it's limited. So what do you think would be more comprehensive? Actually, let me just end by reading what both of these volumes were designed to focus on. So the Du Bois volume, the 4 volumes, it was to focus on it was 500,000 words devoted mainly to the American Negro. And then he said that they would also include the Kingdom of Aksum and the cultural practices in Angola. But the primary focus is on Black folks in the U.S. That's what Du Bois had to say. But what was Woodson's vision about his Encyclopedia Africana? This is what Woodson said and what he wrote. So he said this, that it would be focused on, let me get the quote from him. He said that this encyclopedia he said the encyclopedia would focus on the general Negroes and Negroid peoples throughout the world, especially, guess where? In Africa, you got it, Europe, the West Indies, Latin America, and the United States. That's a forerunner of the work of who? Ivan Van Sertima, with the Journal of African Civilizations. He's talking about the entire world. Let me repeat it, Africa, Europe, the West Indies, Latin America, and the United States. And then he also mentioned Asia as well. So you see the view and the focus and the vision of Woodson. So this is why it's important to know that he's focused on Africa primarily. How can we talk about achievements, accomplishments, and contributions and leave out the African experience? And as Kwame Ture always told us, if you start your history in slavery, the best you can be is a good slave. And that's what people are doing, perpetuating a slave mentality. In fact, it was one of the ladies at the college when I said, look, at Contra Costa Cosby to change this to 2013, she had said that Dr. Woodson is turning over in his grave because I changed it from Black History Month to African Heritage Month. Ha ha ha, he, I love you. So guess what I did? I replied. Yeah, so what I did is that I replied and I tightened her up It said his last books were dealing with Africa, his focus was Africa, and so love you too, he, ha, ha, ha. But I'm sure he's proud of my work to elevate his voice. Finally, the last thing I want to share with you is the themes of the organization. The themes of ASALA, they've changed since the days of Woodson. And I want to give you the actual, the title so you know that we're not making up anything at all. So when Woodson was around, the annual themes of his organization, anybody know what the theme is this year?
Blacks in labor.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. Yeah, so African Americans in labor, and it's something like that. So when they first started doing themes, his organization, 1928, the theme was civilization, a world achievement. They're not limited. And then in 1933, guess what? Ethiopia meets era in truth. 1935, the Negro achievements, guess where? It's in Africa. 1936, it was the title of his next to last book, The African Background Outline. 1937, American Negro History from the time of immigration from Africa to the present day. And they pretty much tailed off. You don't see very much about Africa. There was something in 1960, but in 1971, 72, these certainly would have been some of those students of Woodson following in his footsteps. 1971, the organization's annual theme, African civilization and culture, a worthy historical background. 1972, African art, music, literature, and valuable cultural experience. Nothing else until 1992. And that was the last time anybody had a concern in Woodson's organization about Africa. 1992, the theme was African roots, experience new worlds, pre-Columbus to space exploration. You know why? Because 1992 was a pivotal year. It was a 500-year anniversary since the man who was lost, confused, washed up, and hungry, Columbus, had came through the America. So this was the 500-year anniversary, and all over the Western world, there was going to be the biggest bash in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They were going to celebrate Columbus in North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. But guess what? Native Americans like Jack Forbes and none other than Ivan Van Sertima stepped up and said, you will not be celebrating anything. You can only commemorate that he traveled. So it went from a celebration to a commemoration, ultimately a condemnation. They condemned Columbus as a common criminal.
Yes.
Based on the records. So that's why his organization had basically no choice but to embrace Africa. Since then, nothing. Nothing dealing with Africa. Not because that wasn't the focus of Woodson, but the folks in his organization can't handle it. That's the reality. So my quiz to you, as I close, this is my question to you. Did I make the case for Woodson and African Heritage Month as opposed to simply Black History Month? So
Yes.
in person,
Yes,
please
yes.
take the quiz
Yes.
online. Let's see what you got to say.
Yeah,
Because documentation beats conversation every day of the week.
every day.
And we ain't playing with nobody when it comes to the truth.
Yes.
So thank you very much. I'm Professor Manu Ampim.
Folks can reach me at Manu Ampim at Gmail. That's MANU AMPIM, Manu Ampim at Gmail. Or you can also call 510-878-7279 and let us know that you want to be added to the email list. You can leave your email address. We can add you to the newsletter. And also, if you want to know about the tours to Africa this summer, we're taking a group to Kemet for 2 weeks in June, and then also a 2-week tour to Ethiopia in June and July. These are pioneering tours that go to 25% more locations and villages than any other educational tour. So let us know, and then you also can find me on social media at YouTube. Just go to Professor Manu Ampim, and you can subscribe to my channel, or check me out on Facebook, and you'll know more about my my pioneering work. Thank you very much.